episode of Inside the Recording Studio. I am Jody Whitesides, and with me, as always, is Mr. Chris Hallstrom. How are you today, Chris?
Doing very well, Jody. I'm doing very well. How are you doing?
I'm starting to feel like things are on the mend, as we were discussing before.
Good.
I have become a car mechanic along with being a recording engineer.
Well, it gives you something to fall back on, right? If this doesn't work out, right?
Exactly.
You start working on old Audis.
Yes.
Yeah, right. So tell me about those sensors. No, that's not what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about mixing drums.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a technique that I came across a couple of years ago, and we've sort of talked about it on the podcast before. Something that we can make great use of when we're mixing live drums.
Yes.
Not necessarily only live drums, but it could be like if you're using Superior Drummer or something, this would be good. But if you are just working with a drum machine, you're working with 808s or whatever, you might get varying mileage of this because of what it is. It's the idea of processing the drum bus in two parts. So that one is going to be involving the shells, and the other one will be involving the cymbals or the overheads.
Right. And in talking shells, you mean things like the kick, the snare, the toms, and anything else that's metal, such as hi-hat, ride, and crash cymbals. That's the metal portion, or the second portion.
Yes, exactly. So hi-hats, like you said, hi-hats, crashes, rides, all that kind of stuff. That's going into a separate bus.
Right.
The reason why this is a good idea is we often process our drum bus a certain way. And it's not uncommon to have compression and EQ and those things. If you are just routing things and not doing any processing on your drum bus, well, you can listen anyway, but this is not pertain to you, but maybe you'll learn something. But this is assuming that you do any kind of processing on there.
Yes.
All right. If you want, let's say, a little bit more of an aggressive in-your-face drum sound, kind of like what we talked about with compression last week, right? And what to listen for. It can sometimes mess with your overheads.
Right.
And not altogether pleasant way. So splitting them up will be a good way to kind of solve that. Let me ask you first, like, how much processing do you do on your drum bus? Do you do a whole lot generally? Because you have a little bit of a different routing thing going on than
I do. I don't do too much in terms of extreme things on the drum bus. And
what would be an extreme thing?
Compressing the living snot to the point of pumpage, to me.
Okay.
That, and it's just most of the time I don't work in that genre that would require that. Most of the way it's laid out is similar to how it would be done on an actual console. I've got the individual channels going on for the kick and the snare and hopefully each tom and a hi-hat and overheads and possibly a room mic going as well. And all of that would route into a drum bus, generally speaking. And I would process most of the individual drums in and of themselves in terms of EQs on their individual tracks, whether it's a high and low pass filter or any kind of other sweetening or subtractive type EQ that is needed in order for that particular drum and its channel to stand out and work. That being said, I know that on overhead tracks, most of the time I'm going for the literal cymbals that they're above, and a bit of the room sound, and doing a fairly high pass filter to keep most of the kick and the snare out of that signal. And then I can compress that a little harder if needed to bring all that up in terms of the intensity and the punch that you were talking about. And it's similar-esque to the concept that we're talking today, but I still run all of that into a bus, the entire kit, which then is still another channel strip, which could have maybe some additional little bits of EQ, but generally not. And maybe a little bit of the channel strip compression. And then, as you know, and I've mentioned it on the podcast in episodes past, my new favorite drum bus compressor is the 175B. From Universal Audio, the UA one. And that thing is just magical on a drum bus That's my general routing setup. Have I done what we're talking about in today's episode? Yes, I can think of one or two instances in the past where I've done this. But it's generally when there's a real problem in the difference between what's going on metallic-wise in the drums and skin-wise in the drum.
Yeah, but even if there aren't problems with the source material, I still think it gives a lot more flexibility of what you can do.
Oh, for sure.
I think it's interesting that you mentioned that you tend to cut out a lot of the low end in your overhead tracks. Because that's something that, I mean, there's nothing wrong with that, but there are things that we can experiment with and see what works for us. I generally like to have a little bit of the snare and kick in there. Not so much that it's going to amplify something, but I find that if I take out too much of those in the overheads, that the overheads lose part of their character as well.
So to kind of go off on the tangent for a moment and talking about that and the differences of what we're talking, because I'm guessing it's not as different as you're making it out to be. What would you say is your high pass filter set to on your average there on the overheads?
If I were to use it on the overheads?
Yes.
I would probably go maybe up to like 150, but not more.
My max is probably somewhere around 320.
Okay.
It's not as drastic as I made it sound. It's just enough to keep a lot of the problematic low out of it so that when that compression is working for the overheads, it's not being pumped by that.
Yeah. No, for me, the benefits of the separation of those two or splitting of the drum bus has more to do with how I might treat the cymbals and not so much trying to control leakage, assuming it's not bad, right? Because there are sometimes you have overhead tracks and it's like, it just sounds like a room mic. It's the entire kit, you know?
Sure.
And then you have to think about them a little bit differently and it can be problematic.
Or find that new drum plug-in that you've mentioned before in the past that actually can separate all this stuff.
The Black Salt Audio, the silencer, it's great for that. That's a really, really cool thing. But that one works better for
individual drums and not the overheads.
Yeah, taking out like hi-hats and things like that from snares or from the kick and other shell pieces. But yes, that's a fantastic one on an A side to that. So good looking out bringing that one up. But yeah, so the processing I'm talking about and thinking about with the overheads, if I use compression on the overheads, which I might, because it would depend on how the drummer is played. If there's too much dynamics going on, might get just massaged a little bit. But also things like de-essing, where cymbals are sounding harsh.
Sure.
And just doing that on the drum bus as a whole can have a little bit of a negative effect, I think.
Well, on the ability for your snare to really speak out, I can understand where you're talking about that. While the crack is normally around the 2.2K mark, somewhere in there. The harshness that you're talking about in terms of the cymbal, are you referring to about the 4.1K area?
Yeah, usually up there.
Okay.
Right? Yeah, because you get that really, really SC stuff. And again, depending on drumming style, that can be a problem. If you're doing something where somebody might be a crash ride thing in a chorus or something,
right,
that can just get like really abrasive. And especially if it's a drummer that might not be super comfortable in the studio, if you will, so that they might be a little bit too aggressive. There's a lot of stuff going on as opposed to adjusting for playing style a little bit and maybe not being as heavy-handed as you might be live, right? So it's to try to tame those things.
Sure.
Because, again, it's like when we're dealing with and mixing drums so much today that we're dealing with, like, adding samples and stuff. But on overheads, that's really tricky unless you want to really, really get in there and program every hit. But then it's usually not a good thing to try to replace cymbals, at least not in my experience.
Well, maybe they can start using that new V drum kit we talked about last week or the
Yeah.
week before.
But that's a whole other can of worms,
It
right?
is. It is.
I'm a big fan of separating those out
Okay.
because, again, I can do things now where, let's say that we're talking about the kit pieces, and there might be things I might want to do overall where I might want to have like a little bit more crack, like you mentioned.
Uh-huh.
And bring up a little bit of whatever, like high mids or something to give some clarity.
Right.
But now you're causing chaos for the overheads.
Sure.
So,
Understood.
it just, yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah. And if I want to compress, and again, the shell pieces a little bit more overall and just kind of sort of do that proverbial glue together as a kit, it helps not having the overheads there.
So how would you go about routing this out?
Well, I will have all the different kit pieces, obviously, on their own tracks, right?
Yep.
And I would say, just to say numbers, I would route all the kit pieces to a bus. And for me, that's usually 10 because it's an old MIDI channel hangover. Was always 10.
Okay.
So my drums always reside on bus 10. And I would simply do the overheads and hi-hats and things like we mentioned. If there's a separate ride or whatever, all of those pieces will go to 11.
Okay. Now, question on that.
Yeah.
Room mic. Which bus is it going into?
More often than not, it would go into the overhead.
So it would go into the metals channel that you're talking about setting up on 11.
Yeah, because it would have so many of those elements. Now, if I want to have more of an aggressive sound on the room mic, I will obviously just do that on the individual room mic.
Okay.
Yes, but that's a good question. I would generally put that in with the overheads.
All right. Do you ever have a leak mic as well?
A leak mic?
Yeah, that kind of catches the underside of the snare and the kick.
Not to try to necessarily catch it, but if you do have, like we tend to do, like a top and bottom snare, it's unavoidable. Right? You try to minimize it as much as possible, but yeah, I would be really happy if there was no leakage anywhere, but that's not the reality.
That's using samples now, dude.
Right, but even things like today, like when we have like Superior Drummer or whatever, there is leak in all of that. The bottom line, I suppose, is like with all of that together is what makes it sound like an actual drum kit, or like a real performance, or we would just have really clean triggers, and that doesn't sound natural.
Exactly.
I don't want that to be too much so that it's a problem. And in sample libraries generally isn't, or you could just...
So you've talked about you run all of your shells, your kick, your snare, your toms, those sorts of things into a bus 10, as you say, for the old MIDI style. MIDI was always on channel 10. And then you're running all your metals into bus 11, and you're also running your room into bus 11 as well.
Generally, yes.
Okay.
Yeah. But then what I would do, just so I can have sort of like a fader for
riding the entire
my drums, I would bus those two out to a third bus, right? That would now be, or a VCA or whatever you do, but I tend to bus them out. So it would be on yet another bus that would be the overall.
Right. So you would go from those two buses, your shells and your metals, to a singular overall drum bus.
Correct. Generally.
Instead of using a VCA between the shells and the metals.
Well, it could be a VCA, but I tend to not use them.
Right.
But it's the same idea, right? So,
and for those that don't know, I want to quickly clarify.
Yeah.
A VCA is a type of console movement that allows you to retain the fader value between two or more faders when you link certain groups into what they call a VCA. That way, if you move one, they move at the same amount.
They move in the relative value.
Relative
to
values,
themselves.
yes.
Right. Yeah.
So you can set them at different values before you set them into the VCA, and then if you move one, it moves in conjunction with the same amount.
Yeah. Which is a handy way. It's just never really gotten
into your
entrenched
workflow.
In my workflow, yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah. It's kind of late actually when Logic started implementing those.
Oh, Logic was extremely late to the game. And I'm just thinking about it.
Yeah.
I haven't had a need to do it yet.
Right. Now, another thing that you could do with a benefit of this two-bus system, if you will, would be that if you want to, for example, in a chorus, you're going to have like a little bit more energy.
Uh-huh.
You can just bring up the kit pieces for a couple of dB or whatever, and kind of do that automation as opposed to bringing up the drums as a whole, which of course you could do, and it could work fine.
Of course, I do it all the time.
Right. But it's like, so you have, again, like a little bit more of a control over little
Individual
things now.
sections of the drum
Yeah,
kit.
and of course you could still do this with each individual channel, right? But if you have
Compression going on your bus, that would be harder to deal with.
exactly, yeah, because then you're affecting all of that, right? That's a really cool thing. Now, I suppose what I kind of hinted at before is an extreme amount of going into this would be to, during the tracking stage, you're actually recording these separate. So you would have the drummer play just the shells, no cymbals, no hi-hats, anything.
Right.
You track that and then track the cymbals and the overhead separately.
Sure.
That's sort of like maximum control. And that leakage thing goes bye-bye. So,
Well, there's still leakage amongst the metals in and of themselves and then amongst the shells in and of themselves. Unless you
Sure.
go to, hey, I just want you to just play the kick and play the pattern that you plan on playing and see how well you can make that groove. And then I just want you to play the snare and see how well you can make that groove. It has happened. And I know that there are drummers that do it. We had a drummer on as an interview with Christopher Alice. He
had done
has
that,
done that.
at one session. Yeah.
And I know stories of guys like Josh Freeze being called into sessions to come in and play literally one drum,
right.
which is crazy.
Yeah.
But people do it,
Yeah.
and there's a reason behind it.
If you can make that groove, more power to you. But even if you do the whole kit piece, I think that's a fantastic thing because usually the biggest leakage thing is hi-hat.
Sure.
Right, that goes into your snare and just all over the place, right? But now you're making that go away by recording them that way. Now, it takes a special drummer to be able to do that, I think, to make it groove, because it would feel really weird, I'm sure, as a drummer, if you haven't done that in the past.
Sure.
You know?
It's not the easiest thing for drummers to work on that. Individual groove pieces to an individual drum. And this is when I'm hitting it. This is where the feel is supposed to be. You're just kind
yeah, and I mean,
along.
Even if it's not the individual piece, but like a two-piece thing, right? Shells and cymbals, that would be difficult. I would think, again, for maximum control to kind of have that's awesome, I think. I didn't ask you, but you really don't do this all that much, so I guess my question is kind of moot, but when did you get turned on to this technique?
Probably at the point where I had noticed that there was an issue between a particular hit on a cymbal that was clashing with a particular chord on a song.
Yeah, I remember you talking about that. Yeah, that's crazy.
It is, and it required automating just that particular hit because it didn't happen where a similar hit with the crash and a similar hit with the guitar happened anywhere else in the song. It was only at one point, and for whatever reason, on that particular thing, it was a weird confluence of the universe where suddenly those two things were completely not in key with each other, so to speak.
It was a glitch in the matrix.
It was a glitch in the matrix on that particular hit. And it required dealing with the cymbals at that point on a separate basis.
Yeah.
Just to be able to automate that particular thing by itself.
Yeah, that's a strange issue. But again, like we can all go down into like micro level with control. And I think sometimes you can, not in your case, but in the pursuit of ultimate control, we kind of lose the
plot
patient, if you will. Yeah. Yeah. Because the groove and stuff could potentially suffer. Right? For me, this was one of those things where I had a mixing session and there were issues with overheads and the way that they sounded. This was a pretty aggressive drummer that let's be diplomatic and say that he didn't feel like he should have to change his technique because he was in the studio. So a very aggressive drummer. And that in this case, it just caused some issues.
Sure.
So it was one of those things. Okay, well, what do we do? Well, okay, let's try separating these. And I might have heard about it before. I probably have. It's not like I invented this.
No, it's not like either of us invented this. It's a fairly useful thing that many people have done.
It's one of those things that you discover something and then you hear more and more people talk about it because you're just thinking about it more. Mm-hmm. So that was my introduction to it as far as like, okay, if I do it like this, I have more control and I can solve the issues that are present, or at least make them better, if not necessarily completely go away.
One other thing to note about this, if you are tracking a whole band at the same time, it's probably not likely that you're going to be able to ask the drummer to play just the shells and then play just the cymbals and whatnot. More likely in that event, you'll track everybody, the drums will be live, and then you can go back and overdub with the drummer, most likely.
Yeah, I mean, I would go also one step further to say that this is very, very dependent on musical styles. Uh-huh. I think because if you're doing certainly like a jazz thing, you're unlikely, I would say, to have these issues when it comes to a mix, because this really, to me, really just applies to when we have a processed musical style.
Sure.
So it could be like a heavy rock thing when you got a lot of competing elements and everything needs to sound a certain way to be present. If you're dealing with a jazz kit or something, it's more like a whole, and there's so many more dynamics that or at least I wouldn't process it nearly as heavy as I would like a rock thing.
Right.
And maybe even like an old school R&B thing where it's also just like it's the vibe. That's the way the kit's supposed to sound. Like, right?
I don't disagree.
Yeah, but it is a really good technique, and I find that if I just kind of work it into my workflow, and now it's part of my mix template.
Okay.
Where that it goes to a different bus, and even if I don't process them differently, it doesn't matter. I just have the option there.
Sure.
And it is a good way of getting the drum sound to be as glorious as we want them to be most of the time, or at least getting close anyway. Yeah.
All right. Well, with other things that can be glorious, let's move on to our Friday finds. Chris, what have you got this week?
Well, I thought this needed another mention. And in full disclosure, I work for this company now, so it's a little bit of a shameless plug. But it's Nightfall by Realitone. Mm-hmm. I just messed around with it some of this week, and I'm just reminded of an awesome string library that is. And it's just so good sounding. If you want something that's a little bit more off the beaten path as well, it does some really, really cool things. So I thought, well, I'm going to bring this up, and it's Nightfall by Realitone.
Sweet.
What about you, Jody?
Well, in light of an announcement earlier this week by Universal Audio, I'm going with the SSL 4000 bundle.
And yes, you were very excited about this.
Well, it was an interesting announcement because it was a whole lot of things, but I'm picking out this particular thing with the SSL 4000 bundle. And that is, the SSL 4000 bundle is now available as a native plugin in Spark from UA, or UA Connect, I should say. I don't know if they still call it Spark. Not only is it now capable of being used as a native plugin within UA Connect, it also has sidechain ability, which is pretty cool because that's a handy, useful feature when needed to sidechain things with compression and whatnot. The odd thing is, and I can understand why there was a little bit of murmuring, anger, blowback, whatever you want to call it. Gurgling in the internet sphere of UA fans. This is not the first time we're getting the native version was costing money. UA a while back had said, if you already own the plugin, you will get it for free when it goes native. The last plugin that they did with a release of, it was like $3 or $4. People started flipping their lids.
Oh, Jesus.
Yeah. So with this one, there is a $10 charge on this one to get the native version if you already own the 4,000 bundle. Now, my understanding is if you don't get it within the first month, in other words, within 30 days roughly of this release of this podcast episode, you're going to be shit out of luck of getting that $10 value. It will end up costing you $50 or whatever. If you don't already own it, don't worry about it. If you do already own it, get it now before the price ends up going up on you. Who doesn't want an SSL channel strip or G-Bus compressor that has sidechain ability? And if
For
you already
$10.
For $10, so you can't really beat that.
You're going to complain about that? Yeah.
Yeah. And the reasoning apparently behind why they actually started charging for some of these plugins when they go native is that they've done enough in the architecture of updating the plugin that it's no longer technically the same plugin. Overall, it's still an SSL channel, but because they added some additional, the ability to do sidechain, they're considering that an upgrade, not necessarily an addition of a native of a already UAD plugin. That is why.
But that's an interesting point, and this could be a whole podcast in itself. The fact that people would complain about $10. If you're getting an SSL for that and you get the added functionality of a plugin that you already own for $10, and people are going to be upset about that.
Yeah, people are weird.
It's fun.
People are weird.
I guess. But that's cool. Do you use normally the UA or do you use the Plugin Alliance one?
I have it set up with both in terms of templates.
Oh, okay.
And more often than not, I think I use the Plugin Alliance one just because of the minor differences between all the different channel strips.
Mm-hmm. All right.
But with this and sidechain ability, which I don't think the PA has, I might start using this.
All right. Well, there you go.
More often. I know I will set up a template with it. There's no question about that.
Sure.
While we've got your attention, we ask that you go to InsideTheRecordingStudio.com and sign up for our mailing list. You'll need to be on our email list in order to be eligible for future giveaways, and we'll make sure you don't miss any future episodes of this insanely cool podcast. Send us an email at goldstar, GOLDSTAR, at InsideTheRecordingStudio.com with the word overheads, and you'll get something cool back in your inbox. If you've got a topic or suggestion for Chris and I to explain in a future episode, contact us at the contact page and we'll put it into consideration for a future episode. With that, I'll say see you next week.
Thanks for listening, everybody. Have a good one, Jody.